everybody. It's so nice to be here with all of you for a lecture this evening from my good friend John Vick, who I'm going to introduce in a second. I just want to describe what a great honor it is for Woodmere to have George Biddle's paintings and drawings and prints and sculptures and plates on view here in our Cook and Del Bueno galleries. I've felt for the longest time that George Biddle was something of a missing book on the shelf of American art, and seeing the exhibition realized in one place and being able to see all of the work, really for me confirms that that's correct. It's an incredibly exciting show. Many of you who are here have been extraordinarily generous in many different ways, lending art, supporting the exhibition, helping us figure out different parts of the puzzle. I hope everyone on their way out will take a postcard. We have sort of a program card that describes other lectures, gallery talks. We're making a trip to Kelly Drive to visit the Samuel, I'm forgetting the full name. The Ellen Samuel Memorial, which is a large sculpture complex that includes a very, very impressive work by Hélène Sardou, who is George Biddle's wife, and it's an amazing sculpture by her there. It's a joint program with the Association of Public Art. I hope you'll all join us for that. It's a sculpture by Hélène that was shown at MoMA before it came to Philadelphia, and so there's a really interesting story. But anyway, tonight we are here to speak John Vick, who is the director of, John has a long title, I have to read it. He's the director of Collections, Interpretation, and Engagement at Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum. And one of the great exciting dimensions of this show is that it brings Woodmere and Andalusia together in new kinds of ways and in deep ways. And we've got other George Biddle exhibitions up our sleeve in our future. Some of you, may have seen that, and I know John's going to speak a little bit tonight about the drawings from the Nuremberg trials. Those drawings, and there are a few hundred of them, those need an exhibition unto themselves because they're so deep and they're so complicated, and there's a lot to be studied and a lot of questions that are being asked about the Nuremberg trials in contemporary scholarship and thinking, and we need to bring these drawings into that conversation. And we couldn't do that in the context of this big show, but there's a lot of research there into not only George Biddle, but his brother Francis Biddle, and I know that's, we're going to hear a little bit about that tonight, but I see some really fun projects with Andalusia in our future together as we dig deep into that and other aspects of this wonderful art that's on view. So John at Andalusia oversees public site visits, ongoing preservation efforts, and research into more than 2 centuries of residency on the property. John attended Boston College, also attended the University of Pennsylvania, has degrees in art history from both institutions, and spent 13 years working at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We are both PMA alums and have the scars to show it, but we're very proud of that. And in John's 13 years at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, he curated and contributed to over 20 exhibitions and books on a range of topics from Marcel Duchamp to historical African art. His final project there was managing the creation of the pretty amazing new American art galleries that we all love and go back to over and over again. And this was, of course, a component of the core project designed by architect Frank Gehry. John was born in Philadelphia, grew up in the suburbs, and now he lives in Fishtown, with his wife and daughter. So let's have a big round of applause to welcome John Vick.
All right. Well, thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate the introduction, Bill. And I want to thank you all for coming out to celebrate this exhibition of George Biddle's work and to support Woodmere. It's an honor to be here to add my perspective to this conversation about this great artist's work. So as Bill mentioned, I am the long-titled Director of Collections, Interpretation, and Engagement at Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum. Andalusia is located on the Delaware River, just north of Philadelphia. Andalusia has been the ancestral home of the Biddle family for more than 2 centuries. It is also the repository, as alluded to, of a history about the wider Biddle family going back to 1681. And so, Bill and I, probably within weeks after I started there in February, we got together and he thought it would be interesting and fitting if for this exhibition, I shared a little family context about George Biddle, if I filled out his genealogy with some other biographies and tried to position this artist in the illustrious old Philadelphia family in a way that might further what we know of him and his art. So, before I begin, though, there's something else to share, which is that I was a fan of George Biddle long before I got to know any of the Biddles at Andalusia. Prior to beginning my job at Andalusia, I worked at the PMA, as Bill mentioned, and my projects there varied a lot, but over a period of time, they tended to circle back to American art and art of the 20th century. And one artist who kept popping up on my radar was George Biddle. Of the museum's many works by George Biddle, there was one in particular, a fantastic self-portrait shown there and back there on the wall, that really captivated me. In it, the artist sits in the woods, not in a studio, but the woods, which is quite noticeable. It's fall, and the ground is blanketed in the warm, earthy tones of decaying leaves. Biddle wears a big overcoat, and it's the same silvery white as the birch trees behind him. But the coat has the sculptural volume and shadowy crags of a boulder. Biddle is solid, as fixed as his gaze, which stares back at you with an air of confidence and perhaps an invitation to grab your own coat and step through the canvas, to join the artist in the crisp fall air. And for me, I have always been someone as happy at a museum as I am in the woods. I felt that the artist somehow understood me. And so when I could, I looked for an excuse to get the painting and others by Biddle out of storage and into the galleries. Only recently, however, in talking to Bill, did I learn that I wasn't the only one to feel an affinity to this particular work. In the foreword to the exhibition catalog, Bill discusses seeing the painting at the PMA in 2014, completely coincidentally in a gallery that I would have curated, and he cites it as one of a few key moments of inspiration for the show that's here today. Now, this was supposed to be a fun reveal, but I didn't realize that we'd be speaking here in this space. But we are recording, so this image should be useful for anyone who watches this afterwards. But what a show we have. It really grants us a rare opportunity to see the full scope and trajectory of Biddle's career, including that self-portrait back there on the wall. So tonight, however, I want, if we can, to ignore this fabulous exhibition, if only for a little bit, and to a lesser extent set aside Biddle himself as well, so that we can consider the famous and accomplished family from which he descended. I'd like to do this because being a Biddle mattered to George. It mattered in an objective sense, in that his ancestry granted him from birth a certain amount of privilege, wealth, and name recognition. But it also mattered to him personally, although, as we'll see, his sentiment towards the family was not always positive. I'm going to begin with a quote from Biddle's 1939 autobiography called An American Artist's Story. The book is filled with interesting anecdotes and personal musings. It recounts his childhood in Philadelphia, his formative years at Groton Boarding School and Harvard, a stay in California, and cowboying around Texas and Mexico. The book goes into his artistic development in Paris, Tahiti, and New York, and it covers the influence of the Mexican muralists and Biddle's own murals at the Department of Justice, including his role convincing President Roosevelt, a Groton and Harvard classmate, to establish the government's federal art project. The book then ends with political statements on creativity and art's social significance. The passage I'd like to quote comes from the middle of the autobiography. George is discussing the value of hearing criticism from other artists as a way to improve his own art and keep himself grounded. And he shares a line from the painter Marsden Hartley. Quote, Hartley said to me around 1926 in Paris, with one of his sour flashes of clipped New England understatement, fixing on me his pale, icy, and judicial glance, and sadistically mouthing his words, Biddle, I like your work, but there are two things about you which, in achieving any measurable reputation, you will have a hard time ever to live down. Your name and the fact that you painted in Tahiti. So it's no surprise that Biddle would remember this conversation more than a decade later when he set about to write his autobiography. And I don't think it's the part about Tahiti that really made it memorable. That, for me, is just a kind of snide comment about exoticism and escapism. No, it was definitely Hartley's comment about the Biddle name that I think stuck with George. And including the quote in his autobiography was a way for George to acknowledge where he came from, while also distancing himself from what he believed that name represented. And I'll get to that in a moment, but first, who were the Biddles? Excuse me, I'm going to drink some water. So, I jumped 2 pages, I'm sorry. So, I'm going to pick up the story of the Biddles in 1633 with the birth of William Biddle in Burlingham, England, located between Birmingham and London. William's father, Edward, was a yeoman farmer. His mother, Penelope, taught him and his 7 siblings how to read, using the Bible and likely with help from the local Anglican minister. William also learned how to grow crops, tend animals, shear and butcher livestock, and other farming skills. At 16, William moved to London. Having an older brother, William stood little chance of inheriting the family farm. But in London, he lived and apprenticed with his uncle, Thomas Biddle, a leather worker. However, it was the influence of Thomas's wife, Esther, that was perhaps more consequential. Educated and from near Oxford, Esther began attending Quaker services in 1654, drawn to the new religion by her disillusionment with the Church of England. She brought her new convictions home, sharing them with her husband and nephew, who was now 21. Later in life, Esther preached across the United Kingdom, as well as through the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and in Newfoundland. However, back in mid-17th century London, Esther, Thomas, and William had to endure religious persecution. Quaker meetings were made illegal in 1660, and during the subsequent decade, all 3 of them spent time in Newgate Prison for their religious practice. Another person to do time at Newgate for her Quakerism was Sarah Smith Kemp, who William would marry in 1666, not long after the death of her first husband. William was 33 and Sarah was 32. Living on Bishopsgate Street near the Devonshire Meeting House, in a home that Sarah had inherited along with an inn, William and Sarah soon became rooted in the daily business and religious life of their Quaker-leaning neighborhood. And in 1669, they welcomed their son, William, into the world. They had 5 other children, but none of them survived past age 3. And then in 1678, their daughter Sarah was born. By this time, plans were developing for a new colony in New Jersey that would be made by the Quakers. There, they could establish a self-governing community away from the religious persecution they were experiencing in London. Quaker leaders had already begun purchasing large tracts of land from the Lenape, for whom New Jersey was the ancestral homeland. And these tracts were then divvied up and sold to individuals like William and Sarah. In August of 1681, the same year as William Penn's Pennsylvania charter, the Biddles left London for Burlington, New Jersey, on the ship Thomas and Anne. They established a farm called Mount Hope, and over the next 3 decades became leaders in their burgeoning Quaker community. William served as assemblyman, judge, a member of the governor's council, and remained involved in the local Quaker meetings in Burlington and Philadelphia. Throughout, William and Sarah appear to have held true to their belief in religious freedom, even when they were among the ruling majority. They allowed their daughter to marry a non-Quaker, despite reproach from others in their meeting, and William oversaw non-Quaker marriages as part of his government duties. So at this point, you're probably wondering how long I'm going to be stuck in the colonial era. This is a modern artist you came to hear about, after all, and we haven't even gotten to the Revolution. So I'm going to hurry along, and I will skip over William Jr. and jump to William III and John. And I also want to point out that I know I am skipping many of the Biddle women, but a conversation about Biddles and their name in particular is going to favor the men who had the privilege of retaining that name even through marriage. Moreover, as it happens, I've been told that one reason for the preponderance of Biddles and the name is that they tended to have more sons than daughters. That could be a myth, but looking at George had 3 brothers and no sisters, and on the paternal side, 2 uncles and no aunts, and 2 great uncles and no great aunts. There are, and there have been, some really amazing Biddle women, either born with that name or who took it through marriage, and I will get to some of them later in the talk, though. For now, back to William III and John Biddle. Both brothers left New Jersey for Philadelphia, and both had large families with many notable descendants, establishing two main branches of the Biddle family tree. We can think of William III's branch as the Andalusia side, and John's as the George Biddle side. But, thanks to a trustee at Andalusia, I was introduced to this more satirical shorthand in Nathaniel Burt's 1963 best-selling book, The Perennial Philadelphians, The Anatomy of an American Aristocracy. His, quote, enormously simplified Biddle genealogy dubs William III's branch the Romantic Biddles and John's as the Solid Biddles. And you'll find out why. Starting with the Romantic Biddles, we see three of William III's sons. We have Edward, who fought in the French and Indian War and was a Pennsylvania assemblyman going back to the First Continental Congress. He married Elizabeth Ross, not to be confused with Betsy Ross, but Elizabeth Ross was Betsy Ross's sister-in-law. Edward's brothers included Charles, a merchant and revolutionary who later served as Pennsylvania's lieutenant governor, which at the time was called vice president, and another brother who is dubbed in the chart as Nicholas the Blown Up. He's a captain in the Continental Navy who died when his ship, the Randolph, blew up in a sea battle with the HMS Yarmouth in 1778. This designation, the Blown Up, is meant to differentiate Nicholas from his namesake and nephew, Charles's son, Nicholas the Great. Nicholas the Great, as he's called, would be the first Biddle to live in Andalusia. Before that, however, he was a child prodigy. Graduating from Penn at 13, from Princeton at 15, he served as secretary to the U.S. minister to Napoleonic France. He worked on the financial details of the Louisiana Purchase. He was secretary to James Monroe while Monroe was U.S. minister in Britain. He edited the literary magazine Portfolio and the journals of Lewis and Clark. And he sat on the Pennsylvania House and Senate, all before he turned 30. So, Nicholas's real career, however, began in 1822 as president of the Second Bank of the United States, which controlled the nation's money supply, regulated interest rates, lent to state banks, and acted as the government's fiscal agent. Although Nicholas would lay the groundwork for modern-day central banking, his efforts were forestalled by the destruction of the bank in the Bank War, a series of political and economic skirmishes fought between Nicholas and President Andrew Jackson and their respective allies. In some cases, in fact, the Bank War sparked real violence, as in 1831 when Nicholas's brother Thomas came to blows with Missouri Congressman Spencer Pettus, a Jacksonian. Thomas, who had been dispatched to St. Louis to help open and manage a branch of the Second Bank, took offense to Pettus's criticism of the bank. The verbal attacks escalated to physical attacks. Neither man had any wisdom to back down, and so a duel was fought with pistols at 5 paces. Just 5 paces. Both men died of gunshot wounds, and at Andalusia we have a silver memorial vase and a locket with Thomas's hair on view commemorating the terrible incident. Another brother was Commodore James Biddle. He served in the U.S. Navy for 48 years, with service spanning from being a naval officer to an international diplomat. As a midshipman on the USS Philadelphia, Biddle was captured off Tripoli and imprisoned by the Barbary pirates for 19 months. Later, he claimed the Oregon country for the U.S. and helped negotiate a trade treaty with Turkey in the 1820s. In 1845, the Commodore exchanged ratifications for the Treaty of Shanghai, the first trade treaty between the United States and China. His attempt to forge a similar treaty with Japan was unsuccessful, however. Back home, he was also instrumental in establishing organized study for midshipmen. We have an exhibition room in Andalusia dedicated to the Commodore, and it's filled with objects that he brought back from China. Excuse me. However, when not at sea, the Commodore usually stayed at Andalusia, in a room reserved for him by Nicholas and Nicholas's wife, Jane. Even with their home on Spruce Street, Andalusia, located 13 miles north of Center City and accessible by river, was fundamental to the couple's life and their identity. For Nicholas in particular, I think that Andalusia illustrates that he was much more than a banker. He was a scholar and a poet, an experimental farmer, an early proponent of Greek Revival architecture, traits that all came to the fore with his time spent at the country estate. Built in 1797 by Jane's parents, John and Margaret Craig, Andalusia was, as you see in this slide, rather a traditional Federalist-style mansion to begin. However, in the 1830s, Nicholas and Jane, they hired architect Thomas Walter, who later would become known for designing and building the dome of the Capitol building, hired Walter to add a major addition to the mansion house, including the distinctive column porch modeled after the Theseum, a temple in Athens that Nicholas had visited as a young man. A cozy library for Nicholas's 3,000 plus books was among the additions, plus greenhouses warmed by coal furnaces for cultivating table grapes, a pump house along the river to irrigate the gardens, and a variety of other outbuildings. Walking around Andalusia today, and I can't help but note that we have some flyers at the door on your way out, and we've got a great new website if you want to see our hours and tickets. Walking around today, one perceives the sensibilities of those who called it home over the years, and in many ways it is a rather romantic place, in both the older sense of the word, meaning idealized or imaginative or emotional, but also as we might use it today, evoking love. So it's no wonder then that Nathaniel Burt gave this side of the family the romantic nickname. On the other side of the family are the Solid Biddles, descended from William III's brother John. I've wondered if Solid was something of a dig against William III, because William I established his wealth in Burlington, which he passed to William II, but William III did not really have much business acumen. He plunged his family into economic hardship and had to liquidate all of his property to settle debts, and died at 59. His younger brother, the, quote, Solid John, by contrast, did very well in business. He stayed with the Quaker meeting in Philadelphia, and he lived until he was 82. His wife, Sarah, and they together had 5 children, including 2 of the sons who are noted here, Owen and Clement. Owen was a clockmaker, an astronomer, a member of the American Philosophical Society and the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention. He later founded Weston School in Chester County, a Quaker boarding school that still exists today. And during the Revolution, Owen was appointed Deputy Commissioner of Forage under his brother Clement and was charged with finding supplies for the revolutionary forces. Clement, meanwhile, who's pictured there, was a colonel. He fought in the Battle of Brandywine and served as Deputy Quartermaster General for the Middle Colonies and was a close advisor to General Washington. Both brothers, Owen and Clement, passed their names, first and last, to their sons. And so we get Owen Jr., you can see the pattern with the names here, who was an architect, a master builder, who wrote one of the earliest books on architecture ever published in the United States, called The Young Carpenter's Assistant, from 1805. He's known for designing and building the Arch Street Quaker Meeting House, and his younger brother, Clement Cornell Biddle, went into law, was among the founders, of the Pennsylvania Saving Funds, and was its president for 21 years. It's from Clement Cornell that we get his son, George Washington Biddle, another prominent lawyer who also served in public office. He argued cases on the national level and was counsel to the University of Pennsylvania. He donated his collection of law books to the school in 1886, establishing the law library at Penn, which still bears the Biddle name. Today, as you can see here, portraits of Clement Cornell and George Washington Biddle hang side by side at Andalusia. Their serious poses and expressions certainly appear solid, especially compared to the dramatic, windswept, romantic Sully portraits of the Andalusia Biddles. However, that stern-looking man on the right was, according to his grandson, quite jovial and kind. And here's where it all comes back. That grandson was George Biddle. About him, the perennial Philadelphians has the following to say. And bear in mind, this is a satirical book meant to get people upset. Quote, "The most distinguished and by far most rebellious of all creative Biddles has been a sport from the Solid branch, a branch never heretofore marked by the sinister taint of aesthetic talent. George Biddle, in a long and crotchety career as a painter, promoter of the WPA for artists during the Depression, war correspondent and writer, has never failed to indicate his rejection of Philadelphia and Philadelphia values. He has not been too popular at home and has lived for many years in self-imposed exile up on the Hudson." Yeah. The hyperbole aside, George did in fact distance himself from Philadelphia. In his autobiography, the quote from Marsden Hartley that I shared earlier is immediately followed by a lengthy critique of the city. And I want to thank you, Bill, for mentioning that I was born in Philadelphia, that I'm from the area, that I live and I love Philadelphia, because I'm about to read some words that do not reflect very well on the city. So here goes. Philadelphia, says Biddle, quote, has its own brand of integrity. It believes in itself, although there is nothing much any longer worth believing in. It respects its own standards, although these standards are inconceivably shallow and antedate in great measure the birth of our nation. It has the logic and courage to love what it likes and almost always to mistrust or dislike anything worth achieving, anything as a rule that is not Philadelphian. For a century with its tremendous inertia, Philadelphia has relentlessly hated ideas and consequently disliked artists. Artists have in the main reciprocated, and they've run away. One harbored a little love and some respect for Philadelphia, but one loathed it. It's so over the top, I find it somewhat funny. George's loathing, of course, is not directed at the city itself, but to the kind of people that he associated with it. Although born into privilege and very well educated and well connected, George preferred to view himself and his vocation as an artist as somehow aligned not with high society, but with the working class and the common man. This philosophy comes from the Mexican muralists he admired, and it manifested in his art, especially the murals completed in 1936 at the Department of Justice, titled Society Freed Through Justice. In a panel depicting a cramped clothing sweatshop, he even paints himself hunched over a sewing machine. Another panel of people gathered for a humble meal includes his wife and son, Helene and Michael, and his brother Francis. When George published his autobiography a few years later, he put a photo of himself working on the mural across the spread from a mural scene of a farmer milking a cow. The paired illustrations, which are just so obvious and similar in their composition when you look at them in a book, liken George's work to the farmers, portraying himself as akin to, or at least allied with, the salt of the earth people in his murals. Just forget that the Mural Commission had anything to do at all with his schoolboy connections to FDR. As a progressive artist aligned with working class concerns, George saw himself as somehow set apart from the wider Biddle family, or at least the society and worldviews he believed that they uniformly represented. Indeed, there's no indication he ever visited Andalusia, the place most associated with the family. A guest book owned by resident Letitia Glenn Biddle accounts for many of the mansion's visitors from 1910 to 1950. I've scoured it for George's name, but to no luck. By contrast, his brother Francis appears in the book 4 times during the 19-teens, including an overnight stay with his wife in 1919. Furthermore, in 1931, the Biddles held a big reunion at the Pennsylvania Historical Society to celebrate the 250th anniversary of William and Sarah Biddle coming to the region. Around 200 family members were there. His brother Francis and Moncure attended, but George did not. But what if he had? And this is the question that pretty much underpins my whole talk tonight. Might he have met another Biddle he could have related to? Could there have been some pleasant chats had, similar experiences recounted, maybe even friends in common discovered? Might George have found a relative he actually liked, some cousin who undercut this caricature that he had created in his mind of a dull, self-absorbed old Philadelphian? I think so. Otherwise, it would be a very short talk. So, excuse me. The first person who comes to mind is Charles J. Biddle. Born 5 years after George and dying just a year before, the two were true contemporaries. George grew up first in the city and then on the main line before moving to a farm owned by his mother's family in Penlyn. Charles was born at Andalusia to Charles and Letitia Glenn Biddle, owner of that guest book I just mentioned, and he partly grew up there. Photos of him as a young boy, up here on the screen, show him immersed in nature, playing in the fields or by the river, often with a gun or a fishing rod in his hand, a dog at his side. These photos of Charles remind me very clearly of George's description of his own childhood, where George recounts, quote, adventures with fire and water, gun and knife, with horse and dog, bird and butterfly, with great lady, nursery governesses, the not unusual background of a fairly normal boy of our generation. At least in this sense, I think they weren't so different. In education, their lives also paralleled, and they nearly overlapped. George left Philadelphia to attend Groton Boarding School in Massachusetts, while Charles went to Central High. Both were Ivy educated, George at Harvard and Charles at Princeton. Then they both attended Harvard Law, George from 1909 to 1911, and Charles immediately after from 1911 to 1914. As someone with an older sister, I wonder if any professors ever asked Charles Biddle, is that any relation to George Biddle, in that sort of way one does when they recognize a last name. But the chances of them meeting are very slim. George was already studying art in Paris by fall of 1911 when Charles started. He would continue down that path of studying art while Charles stuck to law. Both careers were put on hold in 1917 when they each enlisted to fight in the First World War. George entered the Army, serving in the intelligence section and then in the First Corps. Charles, by contrast, joined the French Air Service and then transferred to the U.S. Air Service's Lafayette Escadrille. A flying ace who downed 7 enemy planes plus another unconfirmed, he was awarded the French Legion of Honor and Cross of War, the Belgian Order of Leopold II, the American Distinguished Service Cross, and the Purple Heart. He and George were involved, in fact, in some of the very same offenses, and both were honorably discharged in early 1919. When the war ended, George went to Tahiti to find paradise, and Charles returned home to a paradise that he already knew, Andalusia. He married Catherine Legendre in 1923, and the two settled into the family estate, which they modernized with electric, plumbing, heating, and other conveniences. Charles became a successful lawyer. I'm not sure what George, as a law school grad himself, would have made of his distant cousin's career, but I expect there's at least one case he would have admired. In 1965, the governor of Pennsylvania selected Charles, along with William Coleman Jr., as special counsels to represent the Commonwealth in the fight to integrate Girard College, which they achieved 3 years later. I should note, the photo here is from that era, but it was taken at Drexel University. Though a lawyer by trade, Charles's passion was Andalusia, in a way that perhaps equaled George's love of his Croton-on-Hudson home and its surrounding land there. Charles cared about preservation and worked to maintain the historical integrity and natural beauty of the property. He also resisted local development that he thought would harm the character of the area, which is today evident in the abrupt change one really feels in your bones when you leave the industrial corridor of I-95 and State Road and turn into Andalusia's quiet wooded drive. Charles really loved trees and directed the planting of many of the tulip poplars now found throughout the property. I've come to associate him with poplars in much the same way I associate George Biddle with those birch trees in his self-portrait. The poplar along the river, seen at the edge of that photo, is now 3 or 4 times as tall. Another relative who was there at the 1931 reunion was Anthony J. Drexel Biddle, Jr. Almost 13 years younger than George, Anthony came from 2 famous Philadelphia families. Nicholas Biddle was his great-great-grandfather, and Anthony Drexel was his great-grandfather. His father, moreover, was Anthony J. Drexel Biddle Sr., a well-known U.S. Marine and a specialist in hand-to-hand combat, whose celebrity would skyrocket a few decades later with the publication of the memoir My Philadelphia Father, adapted into the Broadway play and Disney musical film The Happiest Millionaire. In 1931, Anthony Jr. was on the cusp of his own fame as well. Up to that point, he was mostly known in society circles for being good-looking and well-dressed. He played court tennis and was a founding member of the Palm Beach Bath and Tennis Club. His marriage to Mary Duke ended in divorce that spring, but he remarried to Mary Schultz before the Biddle reunion that fall. Anthony also found time in 1931 to acquire the painting of Biddle patriarch William I that now hangs as a loan at Andalusia. Now, you are possibly thinking, does this not personify the old-fashioned values and interests that George railed against in his autobiography? Is there really anything these 2 men might have in common? Well, just as you cannot judge a book by its cover, you can't always judge a person by one chapter in their life. In 1935, just 4 years after that reunion, Anthony was appointed minister to Norway. He took to the job naturally, and his society upbringing having prepared him for a career that rewarded good communication, information gathering, discretion, and a respect for protocol. In 1937, he became ambassador to Poland, putting him and his family on the front lines of World War I when the Nazis invaded 2 years later. They evacuated, as shown here on the right, through Romania, France, Spain, and the US, ultimately ending in London. There, Anthony helped establish Poland's government in exile and those of other occupied countries. He served simultaneously as ambassador or minister to 8 countries in exile: Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, Czechoslovakia, and Luxembourg, doing so to coordinate relief resistance and refugee efforts. Anthony's impressive diplomatic career won him covers on Life magazine and Ripley's Believe It or Not. After the war, he joined the Army to assist the reconstruction efforts and that led to the creation of NATO, working with Generals Eisenhower and Ridgway. In Germany in July of '46, he married for a third and final time to Margaret Atkinson, an aide in the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and later the chair of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service. Later that summer, he attended the Nuremberg trials that Bill mentioned already. George Biddle attended the trials that same year, possibly as early as February, though possibly later towards the conclusion that fall. George's brother, Francis, presided as judge, and he's the balding man at the top whispering into the ear of the man with the headphones who's doing that. It's possible Anthony, George, and Francis were all in the courtroom at the same time. It's possible they weren't too, but I want to imagine they were. And that possibility reminds me of a quote from George from 1962 that appears in the Woodmere catalog. It's a quote about himself, but I think what George says can speak to all three men mentioned here. Quote, "I have health, social position, as much of an income as I need. I was given a good education, some talent, and enough success. This has given me a lasting sense of obligation to leave the world a little better, those who come after me a little happier, and to have wasted no opportunities." I'd now like to turn to two relatives who worked in the arts, beginning with Ellen Biddle Shipman, a celebrated and trailblazing landscape architect. Born in Philadelphia in 1869, about 15 years before George, she grew up in the Wild West of the late 19th century, in Nevada, Colorado, and the Arizona territories, places where her father, Colonel John Biddle, was stationed. Her childhood surroundings may have resembled the dry, rugged landscapes that George encountered a few days later when he was living in California, Texas, and Mexico, and those surroundings had a formative impact on her. Upon returning to the East Coast for school and then college at Radcliffe, Ellen fell in love with the lush, vibrant flora that thrived only in cooler, damper climates. Ellen's career began in the Cornish Art Colony in New Hampshire, where she moved with her husband, playwright Louis Shipman, in 1884. Their marriage would eventually fall apart, leading to divorce in 1910, but she managed through the separation, a decidedly independent woman, as you would expect from someone who broke into a field that had been dominated so hardly by men. In Cornish, Ellen was surrounded by artists, including Stephen Parrish, whose painting is shown here, his son Maxfield Parrish, Augustus Saint-Gaudens as well. She would later know Childe Hassam, Willard Metcalf, and art patron Mabel Dodge. It's very likely that the artistic circles Ellen fell into over the years overlapped with George's. However, a stronger similarity between the two comes with the degree to which artistry, and particularly color, became central to Ellen's designs. An almost painterly approach that stood in stark contrast to the emphasis on architecture favored by many of her male colleagues. Ellen said that she used plants, quote, "as a painter uses the colors from a palette," end quote. She herself noted the unique skills that women brought to landscape design, including an artistic eye and a willingness to get dirty in the garden, saying, quote, "The renaissance of the art was due largely to the fact that women, instead of working over their drawing boards, used plants as if they were painting pictures as an artist would." Ellen, like George, also recognized that her art could have a place in public life and a role in uniting society through shared experiences. Gardening, she said, quote, "opens a door wider than any other arts. All mankind can walk through, rich or poor, high or low, talented or untalented. It has no distinctions. All are welcome." Now, it's true, some of her gardens that she designed were private gardens, but Ellen also completed public commissions, including multiple plantings at the New York Botanical Gardens between 1928 and 1946, and the creation of the Sarah P. Duke Gardens at Duke University in the late 1930s, which are shown. Incidentally, these gardens were largely financed by Anthony Drexel Biddle Jr.'s first wife, Mary Duke, in honor of her mother. Ellen also had strong ties to local and national garden clubs that encouraged gardening, especially among women, like the Garden Club of America, which wrote its bylaws at Andalusia in 1904 with support from resident Letitia Glenn Biddle, shown. Letitia and Ellen were nearly exact contemporaries. I assume they met, though I am still searching for Ellen's name in Letitia's guest book or for some other proof of what I think must have happened. Ellen, like Letitia, would have been in her 60s when she attended the Biddle reunion. The next and final person I'll profile would have been just 2 years old. That's assuming he attended, his parents would have been there, and I'd like to imagine that he showed up in a little bow tie, but more likely he was home with a nanny. But we can pretend, as I've been doing throughout this talk. James, known as Jimmy, was the youngest son of Charles J. and Catherine Biddle. He was born at Andalusia and would, by the end of his life, reestablish the property as a public site. Jimmy studied art and architecture at Princeton, graduating in 1951. He served in the Korean War with the CIA, paralleling George's intelligence work 30-some years earlier. And immediately after the war, he started as a curatorial assistant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was soon promoted to assistant curator, then full curator, eventually overseeing the entire American wing. In 1966, Andalusia was placed on the National Register of Historic Landmarks. This important designation foreshadowed both Andalusia's future and Jimmy's. 2 years later, Jimmy became president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, an organization dedicated to saving historic sites of national significance and making them accessible to the public. He expanded the capacity and membership of the trust, advocated for the preservation of historic buildings across the country, and played a part in organizing the 1976 bicentennial celebrations. Around this time, he also restored and redecorated the Gothic cottage at Andalusia. 4 years later, in 1980, Jimmy left the trust to establish and run the Andalusia Foundation, opening the main mansion to the public and paving the way for what is today Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum. He passed away in 2005, but his son, Jamie, now chairs the foundation's board of trustees. I have no doubt George Biddle would have appreciated Jimmy's work at the National Trust and his efforts to preserve Andalusia and open it to the public. As I've already discussed, government support of the arts was a central part of George's career, with the Federal Art Project of the New Deal created thanks to his inspiration and school connections to FDR. Additionally, George also imagined a branch of the government that would protect America's artistic treasures well before any such branch existed, as described in his autobiography. Quote, "Someday we shall have a Department of Fine Art which should have the power at its own discretion, as in every other civilized country in the world, to nationalize a work of art, a painting, a sculpture, a public building. We have a conservation department to preserve our forests. We should preserve our art too. Not only Rivera's fresco in Radio City, citing here the controversial mural demolished in 1934, but that beautiful old Georgian mansion in Charleston, South Carolina, that was torn down by wreckers over the protest of hundreds of Charlestonians to make way for a filling station, there referencing the Gabriel Manigault House. This was written in the 30s. In 1949, Congress chartered the National Trust. In turn, I believe Jimmy would have admired, I believe that Jimmy did admire George's work as an artist. His archives at Andalusia include the catalogue raisonné of George's graphic work. It includes an article on George Biddle in Italy and flyers for a show of Biddle's Mexico paintings. He even hung a print of one of George's 1927 watercolors of Santo Domingo, which is shown up there, in the family's cottage. For a moment, in fact, when I first started at Andalusia, I thought that George had also painted this portrait of Jimmy that hangs in the study. Something about the earthy tones and the shadows around the jaw felt right to me, but I was wrong. However, I am very thrilled to announce that thanks to the incredible generosity of George Biddle's family, Megan, Michael, and Liz Biddle, a canvas by George will soon grace the walls of Andalusia as a gift to the foundation. As I wrap up, I want to close with some brief words from one last Biddle, one born well over a century after George, and born after me, in fact, the writer Pippa Biddle. In 2014, Pippa wrote an essay based on personal experience about the problems of voluntourism. That is, the practice of people embarking on trips meant to better the lives or living conditions of people in developing communities, despite not always having the skills needed to accomplish those improvements, and thus sometimes worsening what they set out to fix. Pippa's argument is researched, nuanced, and persuasive, and the essay evolved into a book called Ours to Explore: Privilege, Power, and the Paradox of Voluntourism. And there she writes the following, quote, "Privilege is complicated and multi-layered and goes far beyond race or economics. There is financial and racial privilege, but also educational privilege, geographic privilege, gender privilege, privilege of sex and sexual orientation, and yes, religious privilege. Voluntourists are mostly winners in the privilege lottery, and they try to make up for their position of power by obsessively striving to even the scale. They wish to give things away, time, energy, clothes, technology, to make up for what they have. End quote. Yet there are limits to such altruism, as Pippa is quick to point out. While some forms of privilege, like money and knowledge, can be shared or donated, others, like race, simply can't be. I've thought about this a lot in the context of tonight's talk, not only because the people I've discussed were all winners in the privilege lottery, as Pippa calls it, but also because Pippa's comments bring me back to where we started tonight, to Hartley's dig that George Biddle would never live down his family name. To be clear, a family name exists on a very different level of privilege than, say, race. Yet it too cannot be spent or donated. Sure, you can change your name, but it won't change your ancestry nor the name itself, nor what it means to you or to others. George, Charles, Anthony, Ellen, and Jimmy were all born with the same family name. They may have had different attitudes towards it and at different times in their life, resisting, accepting, retaining, or embracing it. Yet they all tried to find ways to leverage that name and other markers of their privilege to the benefit of others, through a commitment to some greater good, in the service of beauty, freedom, or knowledge, for those around them or for the sake of generations to come. None of them were perfect, but they all succeeded in some measure. And in that sense, I think they all proved Hartley wrong. Thank you.